They stalk the edges of our nightmares, creatures that drink blood, rise from the grave and prey on the living. We know their name. We think we know their story. But long before Dracula cast his shadow over Victorian England, the vampire existed in countless forms. Across centuries and continents, they have taken many shapes. Mesopotamian demons that stole infants from their cribs, Slavic revenants clawing their way from the earth, Chinese corpses that drained life with a touch, and African spirits that dropped from the treetops to feast on human flesh. This is the story of vampires before Dracula, an exploration of how humanity's most enduring monster evolved across cultures, rooted in the primal fear of the dead returning to feed on the living. Their names have changed, their legends have spread, but one thing has always remained true: the vampire never truly dies. Emerging from the mists of prehistory, the earliest whispers of the vampire take shape in the lands where civilization itself was born. In Mesopotamia, the first great cities rose, but so too did tales of creatures that fed on human life. Long before the name vampire existed, the people of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon feared something far older: demons that drank blood, stole infants, and haunted the darkness between the stars. The moonless night stretches over the Fertile Crescent, where the first cities of humankind rise beside the Tigris and Euphrates. It is a land of towering ziggurats, of scribes pressing cuneiform into clay tablets, of laws carved into stone. And it is a land of demons. Among them, none is more feared than Lamashtu, the child snatcher, the blood drinker, the terror of Mesopotamian mothers. She is no simple spectre, but a divine horror, a goddess demon whose cruelty surpasses mortal understanding. Descriptions of her are etched into ancient Sumerian and Akkadian texts, invoking her monstrous form: the head of a lioness, the ears of a donkey, fingers tipped with talons. Her breath is disease, her touch is death. Unlike many demons who serve the gods, Lamashtu is a rogue entity, a force of chaos that answers to no divine master. She roams the night, slipping into homes and cradles, her jagged teeth bared as she leans over sleeping infants. The texts say she gnaws on bones, sucks the marrow, and drinks the blood of men. She's the darkness in the bedroom corner, the cold wind that unsettles a newborn's sleep. The fear of Lamashtu is so potent that even the gods do battle with her. Pazuzu, the winged demon of storms, is invoked to drive her away. Small clay amulets bearing his snarling visage are placed in homes, a grim protection against the mother-killer. These artifacts, buried in ruins across Mesopotamia, are remnants of an ancient war, not between mortals but between spirits. The mere existence of such widespread charm suggests how deeply ingrained the terror of Lamashtu was in the Mesopotamian psyche. This was not a myth to entertain. This was a danger to defend against. But Lamashtu was not alone in the pantheon of blood drinkers. Another more elusive figure haunts the same shadows. She is Lilith, a being whose legend would stretch across millennia, evolving with every retelling. The earliest references to her appear in Sumerian incantations, where she is one of the Lilitu, desert spirits who dwell in wastelands and ride the night winds. Unlike Lamashtu, who is brute force, Lilith is seduction. She is often depicted with flowing hair, her body both alluring and unnatural. In Akkadian texts, she is said to steal children from their cradles and feed on their lifeblood, a theme that persists when her myth migrates to the Hebrew tradition. It is there, in early Jewish writings, that Lilith is reshaped into something more powerful, more terrifying. The alphabet of Ben Sira, a text from around the 8th century CE, reimagines her as the first wife of Adam, created before Eve. But Lilith will not submit. She speaks the secret name of God and flies from Eden, rejecting subservience to man. In punishment, she is cursed to become a demon of the night, hunting infants in their sleep and drinking the blood of the newborn. Medieval Jewish mysticism furthers this transformation. Lilith becomes the bride of Samael, the queen of the demons, a seductress who lures men in the night, leaving them drained of life. Her image is stamped on protective amulets, much like Lamashtu before her. Mothers carve prayers into clay bowls and hang them upside down to trap her spirit. The warnings are always the same. Do not let her near the child, for she will steal its breath, drain its blood, and leave only an empty shell behind. The parallels between Lilith and Lamashtu are undeniable. One an ancient demon goddess, the other a myth reforged in a new religious framework. But their hunger remains the same. It is in Lilith's legend that we see the first clear echoes of the later vampire archetype, a being that is both monstrous and sensual, that seduces and devours in the same breath. Unlike Lamashtu, who is wholly monstrous, Lilith has an eerie allure. She is not a creature of mindless destruction, but of deliberate predation. She embodies the fear of the night, of the unknown, of a predator that does not merely kill, but takes something essential: life itself. These figures, forged in the fires of Mesopotamian belief, are among the oldest recorded nightmares of blood-drinking entities. Their influence would not die with the civilizations that worshipped and feared them. Their forms would shift, their stories would migrate, but their hunger would remain. From the clay tablets of Babylon to the scrolls of Hebrew mystics, their presence lingers. And soon, they would find new homes in the myths of other lands, where their thirst for blood would only grow stronger. The world of the ancient Mediterranean is one where gods shape the fates of mortals, where curses are as real as the breath in one's lungs, and where things that feed in the dark are spoken of only in hushed voices. Unlike the grotesque, bestial entities of Mesopotamian myth, the blood drinkers of Greece and Rome are more human in form, yet no less terrifying in their appetites. They are predators who walk among mortals, hiding behind beauty, seduction, and illusion, always waiting, always hungering. In the fading glow of a dying hearth, an old Greek storyteller weaves a tale of warning. There once was a queen named Lamia, a woman of great beauty and regal grace. But the gods are cruel, and so too was her fate. She was loved by Zeus, and for this she was cursed by Hera, his jealous wife. The punishment was a horror beyond reckoning. Lamia's children were stolen from her one by one, until she was left with only grief and madness. It is said that something inside her broke. The sorrow twisted her, reshaped her, transformed her into a monster. Her beautiful face became a mask of deception. Her lower body stretched and coiled into the form of a serpent, and her thirst became unquenchable. If she could no longer mother children of her own, she would steal them from others. She became a creature of the night, lurking in the shadows, her glowing eyes piercing the darkness, her mouth ready to drink the blood of infants as they lay sleeping in their cradles. Greek poets from as early as the 5th century BCE describe Lamia and her kind as beings that live off the life force of the young, a fate they call worse than death. These myths did not merely serve as entertainment, they were warnings shaping the fears of generations. Parents would speak her name only in cautionary whispers, invoking protective charms to keep her away from their children. But there is something else about Lamia that makes her different from earlier demons like Lamashtu or Lilith. Unlike those monstrous figures, Lamia retains a degree of tragic beauty. Later versions of her myth describe her as a seductress, one who can disguise herself as a beautiful woman to lure men into her embrace. In these stories, she is no longer just a horror that devours children, but something far more insidious, a predator who preys on desire itself. This evolution is important, for it marks the beginning of a theme that will appear again and again in vampire folklore. The deadly allure of the creature that should not be trusted but cannot be resisted. But Lamia is not the only thing that stalks the Mediterranean night. If she is a creature of seduction and sorrow, then Empusa is something else entirely, a being of unrelenting terror. Sent forth by Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft and the underworld, Empusa is a shapeshifter, a creature who walks in disguise, who takes the form of a beautiful woman to lure men into her grasp. But those who fall into her arms do not wake again. They are drained dry, their bodies left lifeless and pale, as if the very essence had been sucked from them. The poet Aristophanes, writing in the 5th century BCE, describes Empusa as a spectral being with a flaming head, one leg of brass and the other the limb of a wild beast. Other sources claim she's a demon who feeds on blood and flesh as she moves between the world of the living and the dead. If Empusa is the hunter of men, then the Strix is the unseen terror that preys on infants in the dead of night. This Roman nightmare was described as an owl-like creature with a shrieking cry, an omen of doom and a drinker of human blood. Roman writers like Ovid and Pliny recorded accounts of the Strix descending upon cradles, using its beak to pierce the flesh of newborns and suck their blood until their fragile bodies withered. And it is here, in this tale of the Strix, that we find something fascinating, a direct connection to later vampire folklore. For the Romans believed that garlic could ward off the Strix, just as it would later be used to repel vampires across Europe. Even the word Strix would later evolve, influencing medieval Latin and early Slavic languages, where it would give birth to the terms striga and strigoi, words that would come to mean witch, revenant, or vampire. So it is in the shadows of ancient Rome and Greece that the roots of the modern vampire legend first begin to take shape. Here in the flickering firelight, myths of seductive blood drinkers, monstrous night feeders, and shape-shifting demons converge. The fears of these ancient civilizations do not disappear. They transform, passed down through generations, crossing cultures, languages, and belief systems. And so we move forward, following these creatures as they slip from the pagan world of antiquity into the realm of the early Christian era, where they will be reshaped, rebranded, and reborn as the demons and witches that will terrorize the medieval mind. With the fall of Rome and the rise of Christianity, the gods of old faded into memory, but the monsters remained. The ancient blood drinkers, Lamia, Empusa, and the Strix, did not vanish. They were transformed. Their legends, whispered by merchants and scribes, carried from port to port, merged with new fears, new beliefs. The creatures of antiquity did not die. They simply changed names. As Christianity spread across Europe and the Mediterranean, many of the old gods and spirits of earlier pagan religions were absorbed into the framework of Christian demonology. The Church, seeking to extinguish pagan beliefs, did not erase these stories. It repurposed them. The fearsome Lamia of Greek legend, who once prowled the night in search of children, found new life in medieval Christian texts. In some translations of the Latin Vulgate Bible, Lilith, first mentioned in the book of Isaiah, was translated as Lamia. The association was no accident. The Church, drawing on Greco-Roman traditions, reinforced the idea that night-flying, child-snatching women were not just myths. They were agents of Satan. Lamia and Lilith, once separate figures, began to blur together. Their stories intertwined into a single undying nightmare of the vampiric she-demon. This merging of legends had profound effects. The Strix, which had already become the Latin striga, evolved further in medieval Europe. By the early Middle Ages, the word striga no longer referred only to a nightbird or a monster. It now meant witch. And witches, as the Church would come to teach, were not just workers of dark magic. They were creatures of the night, stealing infants, drinking blood, and consorting with demons. In Slavic lands, the term striga took on a life of its own. By the 11th century, these terms had mutated into strigoi, which would later come to mean vampire. The ancient Roman fear of the blood-drinking owl demon had taken root in new soil, reshaped by medieval superstition. As the power of the Church expanded, so too did the fear of creatures that lurked beyond the light of salvation. If the pagan gods and spirits were to be dismissed as false, then the terrors of the night had to be given a new explanation. They were no longer simply monsters. They were minions of the devil himself. By the early medieval period, early Christian writers began recording accounts of demonic entities that bore striking similarities to the vampires of earlier civilizations. The Church Fathers wrote of nocturnal spirits that attacked infants and women in childbirth, echoes of Lamashtu and Lilith, now framed in Christian theology as demons preying on the weak. Tertullian, a Christian writer from the 2nd century, warned that demonic forces could take physical form and consume human flesh and blood. His writings were among the first to suggest that demonic possession could manifest as an unholy hunger, a concept that would later find echoes in vampire folklore. St. Augustine, one of the most influential early Christian thinkers, wrote in the 4th century of revenants, or restless corpses returning from the grave. He did not explicitly describe them as drinking blood, but the idea that the dead could rise and torment the living was already taking shape in religious thought. By the 6th century, Christian scholars had labeled many of these ancient blood-drinking spirits as manifestations of Satan's influence. In some texts, they were described as strigai, or witches, women who had made pacts with the devil and feasted on the blood of the innocent. These beliefs would later fuel the widespread European witch trials, where thousands, mostly women, were accused of supernatural predation. But even as witches became the scapegoats of medieval Europe, the belief in the undead, the revenant, the restless corpse, was quietly growing. These were not spirits or demons, but flesh and blood creatures who clawed their way from the earth to feed on the living. And they would come to define the next great evolution of the vampire legend. The classical world had given shape to the nightmare, but the medieval mind would give it a body. The blood drinkers of the ancient world had prowled as demons and spirits. In the centuries to come, they would rise from their graves. And so the ancient fears of Mesopotamia, Greece and Rome would find new life in medieval Europe, not as myths but as horrors that walked among the living. The ancient world had given the vampire its form, a predator lurking in the shadows, a phantom feeding on the breath of infants, a demon slaking its thirst in the dark. But in the medieval era, it would find something far more powerful: a body. Where the vampire had once been a spirit, a god, or a cursed entity, it was now something tangible. It could walk. It could be found in the grave, exhumed, examined. And most terrifying of all, it could come back. This was the age of the Revenant, the dead who did not stay dead. Across the villages and cities of medieval Europe, stories spread of corpses rising from their graves, of figures once loved and buried, returning to drain life from the living. The vampire was no longer a creature of myth. It was the recently deceased, still warm beneath the earth, waiting for nightfall. In the 12th century, an English monk named William of Newburgh began compiling a history of his time. His chronicle, written in Latin, was not a book of myths or fables. It was a sober account of real events as they were understood. Yet within its pages are stories of the dead that refused to rest. William described them as certain prodigies, which are believed to have happened and are known to be true. These were not ghosts nor demons, but corpses that climbed from their graves and terrorized their former neighbors. One such story, recorded in the late 1100s, tells of a reanimated corpse in Buckinghamshire, a man of ill reputation who, after death, began to walk at night, knocking on doors, calling the names of those within. Soon, the people he visited fell sick and died. The villagers, gripped by fear, dug up the body, only to find it grotesquely preserved, its limbs stiff but swollen, its lips red as if still fresh with life. In another case, set in Berwick, a recently deceased man was said to have returned from his grave each night at the same hour, spreading disease and panic. He was finally stopped by local clergymen, who exhumed the body and burned it. The idea of the revenant, the restless corpse, was so prevalent that chroniclers like William of Newburgh stated, "It would be impossible to believe these things, were there not so many cases supported by such weighty evidence." And these fears were not confined to England. In Scotland, the priests of Melrose Abbey uncovered something far worse. In the year 1197, a dead priest was said to have clawed his way from the grave each night. He was seen creeping along the corridors of the abbey, whispering into the ears of the monks, driving them into a sickly madness. When his tomb was opened, they found his corpse grotesquely intact, its mouth curled into a grin, blood smeared around its lips. The monks, horrified, followed an ancient ritual. They dragged his body into the courtyard, drove a stake through his chest and burned him to cinders. This was not the work of storytellers. These were written as fact. In the minds of medieval chroniclers, the undead were real, and they were not to be trifled with. But it was not just strange tales and whispered rumors that fed these fears. There was something else, something far deadlier. A horror that no one understood. A sickness that swept through entire villages. And so the dead were blamed. Medieval Europe was a world without science, without germ theory, without any true understanding of disease. When a sickness spread, when entire families wasted away, there was no clear cause, only suspicion. The plague was not a new terror, but each outbreak brought new horrors. Those who died did not simply pass, they took others with them. It often seemed that when one person died, their family followed, falling sick days or weeks later. The logical conclusion: something was stealing life from the living. In many villages, people turned to the graves of the recently deceased, and when they dug up the bodies, what they found only confirmed their fears. Some corpses were bloated as if they had gorged on something in the grave. Some had blood at the mouth, staining the burial shroud. Some had nails and hair that seemed to have grown, as if they had not stopped living at all. To us, these are all natural signs of decomposition: the release of gases, the loosening of bodily fluids, the skin retracting to make hair and nails seem longer. But to medieval villagers, they had their proof. These were not ordinary corpses, they were feeding, and so drastic measures were taken. Some bodies were staked to the ground, a long wooden pole hammered through the chest, pinning the corpse to its coffin so it could not rise. Some were decapitated, their heads placed between their legs, so that even if they did return, they could no longer see or find their way back home. Some had bricks or stones forced into their mouths, a desperate attempt to stop them from feeding. These rituals became standard practice in parts of Europe, particularly during outbreaks of disease. But the word vampire did not yet exist. These beings were simply revenants, the restless dead, spreading sickness even after burial. The fear was real, and as it spread, it evolved. In Western Europe, revenants remained ghoulish creatures, waking from the grave to bring death in their wake. But in the East, the legend took on a new form. In the mist-laden forests and graveyards of Slavic lands, the vampire was about to be born. To the Slavic peoples, the Upir was not just a rumor. It was a real and immediate danger. Long before the word vampire entered English, the term Upir was recorded in 11th century Kievan Rus. Unlike the Western Revenant, which was a mindless walking corpse, the Upir was something far worse. It was a deliberate predator, one that left its grave to drink blood. The signs were unmistakable. A corpse with a red, bloated complexion, an unusual ruddy glow to the skin. That was not decay. That was a body still feeding. The Upir could be anyone: a sinner, a heretic, a suicide, a witch, someone who had made a pact with evil. And unlike the aimless revenants of Western Europe, the Slavic vampire was cunning. It chose its victims. It started with family members, attacking its own bloodline, appearing in the night to drain their strength. It could shift its form, becoming mist, a shadow, even an animal, traits that later became core elements of vampire mythology. But most horrifying of all, it could turn others into its kind. Entire villages lived in fear of a single corpse spreading vampirism like a plague. And so the Slavic people developed their own grim protections. Corpses were buried face down, so that if they tried to dig out of the grave, they would only burrow deeper. Sickles were placed around the necks of the dead, so that if they did rise, they would sever their own heads. Garlic was stuffed into mouths, not for flavor but as a weapon against something far worse than rot. These rituals shaped the vampire we recognize today, and as time passed, the vampire's legend only grew. But there was one more transformation waiting, one final evolution that would cement the vampire as a creature of horror, a being both feared and hunted. The fear of the undead feeding on the living was not unique to Europe. Across the deserts of the Middle East, the jungles of Southeast Asia, and the mountains of China, the dead walked. They were known by different names, they hunted in different ways, but their hunger was the same. These were not the elegant noblemen of later literature, nor the decayed revenants of medieval graves. They were spirits, demons, curses given form, and in some cases, they were far older than the vampires of Europe, their legends stretching back to the earliest recorded histories of human civilization. In the shifting sands of the Arabian Peninsula, where the night winds carry the voices of the lost, a far older predator waits. It is called the Ghoul, a creature whose name still lingers in languages around the world. Unlike the European vampire who lingers in burial shrouds, the Ghoul does not rest in a coffin. It stalks the lonely traveler. It waits in the ruins of lost cities. It feeds on flesh and drinks the blood of the living and the dead alike. The Ghoul's origins stretch back to ancient Mesopotamian demonology, where a class of underworld entities known as Galu were said to drag souls down into the abyss. These creatures were later woven into pre-Islamic Arab folklore, becoming night spirits that feasted on the weak. The word al-Ghul, meaning the demon or the devourer, first appears in early Arabic texts and later finds its way into the famous 1001 Nights. Here, the Ghoul is depicted as a shape-shifting creature that can take the form of a human to lure victims before revealing its monstrous hunger. Unlike the European vampire, who is often linked to aristocracy and forbidden desire, the Ghoul is a predator of the desolate places of graveyards and wastelands. Travelers fear losing their way at night, for that is when the Ghoul emerges, digging through the sands, feeding on corpses and waiting for the living to stumble into its grasp. In some versions of the myth, the Ghoul is said to attack children, a theme that mirrors the fears of the Stricks and Lamia in Greek and Roman mythology. The Ghoul can also be female, such as the dreaded Ghula, a monstrous being in Bedouin legends who lures men into the desert with beauty only to tear them apart. There is a chilling familiarity to these stories, a nocturnal creature that consumes blood and flesh, lurking on the edges of civilization, waiting for the unsuspecting. Even in later centuries, the term ghoul would spread into Western horror fiction, taking on new meaning as an eater of the dead, a grave robber, a revenant with an unholy appetite. But in its homeland, the ghoul is still spoken of with caution. Its legend remains intact. In the dense forests and burning cremation grounds of India, another ancient predator waits. It does not lurk in a coffin or emerge from a grave, for it has never been buried. It lives in the corpse itself. The Vetala is a being described in Hindu mythology, an undead spirit that possesses and reanimates the dead. Unlike the European vampire, which feeds on blood, the Vetala's hunger is different. It steals life force. It whispers in the ears of the living. It drives its victims to madness. The most famous collection of Vetala stories appears in the 11th century Sanskrit text, the Vetala Panchavimshati, 25 Tales of the Vetala. These tales depict a world where the dead do not always stay dead, where a Vetala can take over a body and pretend to be alive, only revealing itself at night. Kings, sorcerers, and holy men encounter these creatures, often requiring special rituals to banish or trap them. The most terrifying trait of the Vetala is that it cannot be killed by conventional means. A stake through the heart is useless. Fire is meaningless. It must be removed through spiritual or magical intervention, which often involves complex rites performed by Brahmins or tantric priests. There are also pisakas, similar entities described in Indian folklore. These creatures are flesh-eaters, depicted with dark, shriveled skin and glowing red eyes, lurking near cemeteries and feasting on both the living and the dead. Some texts claim that they spread disease, a belief eerily similar to the plague-spreading vampires of medieval Europe. The influence of these tales did not remain in India. During the British colonial period, translations of the Vetala Panchavimshati reached the West, most notably through Sir Richard Burton's 1870 collection, Vikram and the Vampire. This work introduced the Vetala to English readers, explicitly calling it a vampire and describing its bat-like behavior, hanging upside down from trees, waiting to strike. Even Bram Stoker is believed to have been aware of these translations, and some scholars suggest that elements of Dracula's abilities, his mind control, his ability to shapeshift, his connection to madness, may have been influenced by these Hindu legends. The Vetala is a vampire of the mind as much as the body, and in the shadowed burial grounds of India, its legend endures. In the dim glow of the lantern, the villagers whisper of a corpse that does not decay. It stands upright, its limbs rigid, its skin pale and tinged with green. It moves in sudden jerking hops. It does not drink blood, not in the way of European vampires. Instead, it drains the very life force from those who cross its path. This is the jiāngshī, the hopping corpse of Chinese folklore, a being both feared and ridiculed, its legend surviving in stories passed down for centuries. Unlike the Ghoul or the Vetala, the jiāngshī is not a creature of seduction or trickery. It is an unthinking corpse, brought back to a form of twisted half-life by improper burial rituals or the interference of dark sorcery. In Qing dynasty legends, a jiāngshī could be created if a body was exposed to yin energy for too long, or if it was buried in the wrong place, disturbing the balance of nature. The jiāngshī does not hunt in silence. It moves in a stiff hopping motion, its limbs locked from rigor mortis. Some versions of the myth say it feeds on the qi or life essence of its victims, draining them of energy until they collapse lifeless. Others claim that it drinks blood, a detail that would later lead to comparisons with Western vampires. Taoist priests were often called upon to deal with these creatures, using special talismans, yellow papers marked with red inscriptions, to stop the jiāngshī in its tracks. Other protective measures included mirrors, which the creature was said to fear, and the ringing of bells, which could disrupt its spiritual energy. The jiāngshī's legacy in Chinese folklore is still strong today. In Hong Kong cinema, it has been portrayed as the Chinese counterpart to the Western vampire, reinforcing the idea that the fear of the dead returning to prey upon the living is universal. Beneath the heavy jungle canopy, among the villages of Malaysia and the Philippines, another nightmare unfolds. Here, the vampire takes its most grotesque form. In Malaysia, it is called the Penanggalan, a woman by day, but at night she separates from her body, leaving only her floating head, her entrails dangling beneath her as she takes flight. The Penanggalan hunts newborns and pregnant women, drawn to the scent of blood and birth. It slips through windows, its long, thin tongue reaching out to drain the life from its victims. In the Philippines, a similar creature exists, the Manananggal. It too is a woman who detaches from her lower half, flying into the night with leathery wings. It hunts sleeping villagers, drinking their blood with a needle-thin proboscis, much like the vampires of Western myth. These creatures are defeated not with crosses or stakes, but with salt, garlic, and sharp thorns, which trap their trailing entrails. These Southeast Asian vampires, unlike their Western counterparts, are not the undead, but living creatures, cursed or born with their horrific affliction. But their hunger remains the same. The vampire's legend had taken shape in the East, in the gulls of the desert, the Vetala of India, the jiāngshī of China, and the winged horrors of Southeast Asia. Each culture gave its own name to the predator that drained life from the living, proving that this fear was not isolated to one people, one land, or one time. But the hunger of the dead did not stop there. Across the vast landscapes of Africa and the Americas, blood drinkers emerged in forms both monstrous and familiar. Some lived among the living, hiding behind human faces, striking in the depths of night. Others roamed the wilderness, creatures that lurked in trees, that flew through the air, that carried the scent of death itself. These beings, formed in different cultures, untouched by the vampire myths of Europe, nonetheless shared eerie similarities. The vampire was not a single creation, it was a universal fear. The forests of West Africa are dense, their shadows deep and unmoving. Among the Ashanti people of Ghana and Togo, stories are told of creatures that dwell high above, hanging from the treetops. They are called the Asanbosam, human in shape but with iron teeth and feet like hooks. They do not wait for their prey to come to them. They drop from the branches onto unsuspecting victims, their teeth sinking into flesh, drinking deep. Unlike the European vampire, which hides in the grave or the castle, the Asanbosam is a creature of the wild, a predator that belongs to the forests. Hunters speak of hearing them in the trees, the faint creak of shifting weight above, the snapping of branches just before something falls onto them from the darkness. Closely related to the Asanbosam is the Sasabonsam, a being far more fearsome. It is said to be 20 feet tall, covered in thick red hair, its enormous bat-like wings folding over its body like a cloak. Unlike the solitary vampires of Western lore, the Sasabonsam does not hunt alone. It is part of something larger, something communal. The Ashanti believe that to speak its name too often is to invite its attention. Villagers avoid the deepest parts of the forest, knowing that something is always watching. But in Africa, the vampire is not always a monster of the wild. Sometimes it walks among the people. In Ashanti belief, there is a figure known as the Obayifo, a being both human and not. Unlike the vampires of Europe, which are created in death, the Obayifo is born. It is a person, man or woman, who harbors a hunger so great that it cannot be sated by ordinary means. By day, they live among the village unnoticed, unsuspected. But at night, they leave their bodies behind, traveling unseen, slipping into homes, drinking the blood of children, withering the crops with their presence. The fear of Obayifo witches runs deep, and when Africans were taken across the Atlantic, these beliefs did not die. They merged with new ones, adapted to new lands. In the Caribbean, the Obayifo became the Soucouyant, and a new kind of vampire was born. But before following the legend across the sea, there are still others to meet in the darkness of Africa. In southern Africa, the Impundulu, or lightning bird, is said to serve as a familiar to witches, attacking victims at their command, drinking their blood. In East Africa, tales of the Popo Bawa, a winged demon that preys on sleeping victims, persist even into modern times, with reported sightings as recent as the late 20th century. Each of these creatures is different. Some live in the trees, some fly, some walk unseen among men, but their hunger is the same. The vampire in its many forms had crossed oceans long before the Europeans ever set sail. Long before the arrival of Spanish ships, long before the Catholic priests brought the fear of the devil to the New World, the Aztecs already knew something terrible waited in the night. They called them Cihuateteo, the spirits of women who had died in childbirth, forever cursed to wander the roads and crossroads, their pale skeletal faces frozen in agony, seeking vengeance against the living. To the Aztecs, childbirth was a war, and those who died in labor were honored like warriors. But there was also fear. These women had died unnaturally before their time, and so they were not at peace. The Cihuateteo did not just haunt the crossroads. They sought out children, much like Lilith, much like Lamia. They would press their spectral mouths to the lips of the sleeping, stealing their breath, draining their life. Their cries in the wind were a bad omen, a warning that death was coming. Even after the fall of the Aztec Empire, the legend did not vanish. It merged with Spanish Catholicism, transforming into the weeping woman, La Llorona, forever searching for lost children, her sorrow now eternal. But the vampire of the Americas was not always a ghost. Sometimes it was flesh and blood, and it lived among the people. In the humid darkness of Trinidad, Haiti, and Dominica, people lock their doors at night, not for fear of robbers, but for something far older. The Soucouyant is a woman, a neighbor, a healer, perhaps, but when the sun sets, she sheds her skin. Beneath the disguise of human flesh, she is something else entirely, a glowing ball of fire, flickering through the night, slipping through keyholes and under doors seeking blood. She does not kill outright. She takes just enough to sustain herself, leaving her victims marked by strange bruises, signs of her passing. But should she take too much, Her victims grow weak, then die, and she moves on to another town. The Soucouyant is not without weakness. Salt, garlic, rice, these can slow her down. Like the vampires of Eastern Europe, she is compelled to count grains left in her path, forced to pause and tally each one before she can enter a home. But the true way to defeat her is far worse. Some say that if you find her discarded human skin, you can burn it before dawn, trapping her in her monstrous form, leaving her forever exiled from the world of the living. Like the Obayifo of Africa, the Soucouyant is not an outsider. She is one of them. She walks among them in daylight, blending in. And so people watch their neighbors carefully. They avoid eye contact with the old woman at the market, whispering that she is not what she seems. The vampire had been lurking in the shadows of folklore for centuries, whispered of in villages and recorded in medieval chronicles. It had been a revenant, a restless corpse, a family curse. But in the 18th century, it became something more. It became a crisis. What had once been local superstition suddenly erupted into full-blown hysteria, not in darkened taverns or among uneducated peasants, but in the courts of European rulers and the records of government officials. Vampires became a matter of state. The panic began in the remote corners of the Habsburg Empire, in regions that had long been steeped in vampire beliefs. In the villages of Serbia, Moravia, and Wallachia, disturbing reports began to surface. Stories of the dead rising from their graves to attack the living, of entire families wasting away, their blood seemingly drained from within. The accounts spread rapidly, and unlike the folklore of earlier centuries, these were not cautionary tales or monastic scribblings. These stories were official reports, signed and sealed by government representatives. In the year 1725, in the small Serbian village of Kisilova, a peasant named Petar Blagojević died suddenly. Days later, his son claimed that his father had come to him in the night, appearing at his bedside, pale and wide-eyed. The next morning, the boy was dead. More deaths followed, each one preceded by reports of visitations from the deceased Blagojević. The villagers, gripped by terror, pleaded with the authorities. When the local magistrate and a contingent of soldiers arrived, they dug up Blagojević's body and recoiled at what they found. The corpse looked fresh, its hair and nails appearing to have grown, its mouth smeared with blood. To those present, this was no ordinary dead man. This was something still feeding. Without hesitation, they drove a wooden stake through his chest. Some witnesses later claimed that the body let out a groan as the wood pierced it. It might have ended there, a single case, an isolated exhumation. But it did not. Just a few years later, in 1732, another Serbian village, Medveda, became the epicenter of an even greater vampire panic. The case revolved around a man named Arnold Paule, a former soldier who had died suddenly from a fall. But in the weeks after his burial, villagers began to report seeing Paule walking through the streets at night, his eyes hollow, his skin sallow, his breath carrying the stench of decay. Then the deaths began. 4 villagers died under mysterious circumstances, each one sickening rapidly after claiming to have been visited by the dead man. Panic spread through the town. Fearful that Paul had become a vampire, the villagers took drastic action. His grave was unearthed. The reports say that his body was found completely undecayed, with blood pooling around his lips as if he had recently fed. In a desperate bid to end the nightmare, the villagers followed long-standing vampire rituals. They drove a stake through his chest, whereupon, it is said, the body let out a terrible shriek. To prevent further horrors, they burned his remains and scattered the ashes. But it was too late. In the months that followed, others who had died after Paul were also seen rising from their graves. These too were exhumed, their bodies similarly intact. Once again, stakes were driven, heads were severed, and corpses were burned. But this time the event was documented in full detail by Austrian officials. One of these officials, Johannes Flückinger, a regimental medical officer, compiled a thorough report titled Visum et Repertum, Seen and Discovered. His report described, with clinical detachment, the signs of vampirism observed in the bodies. The villagers believed without doubt that these corpses were feeding on the living. Fluckinger's document was sent to Vienna, where it circulated among the educated elite, making its way to scholars, noble courts, and military strategists. The vampire hysteria had become official. The reports from Serbia ignited a firestorm across Europe. The word vampire, previously an obscure term from Slavic folklore, now appeared in print for the first time in Western newspapers and academic journals. The educated elite, rather than dismissing the accounts outright, found themselves enthralled and horrified. These were not medieval fairy tales. These were documented exhumations, conducted under the supervision of government officials and medical examiners. Could it be possible, some wondered, that vampires were real? The case of Arnold Powell and the vampire epidemic of Serbia became the subject of dozens of essays and dissertations. Scholars across Germany, France, and England debated what might be causing the phenomenon. Some turned to medicine. Was there a natural explanation for why some corpses seemed to resist decay? Others sought a theological answer. Were these revenants damned souls cursed to walk the earth for their sins? One of the most famous works to emerge from this debate was a 1746 treatise by Dom Augustin Calmet, a French Benedictine monk. His book, Dissertations sur les apparitions des esprits et sur les vampires, was an exhaustive analysis of vampire cases, blending theology, folklore, and contemporary reports. He neither confirmed nor denied the existence of vampires, but he treated the accounts with serious consideration, compiling eyewitness testimony and detailing cases from across Europe. His work became widely read, fueling both belief and skepticism. Even the great Voltaire weighed in, writing in his philosophical dictionary in 1764, "Vampires in Poland and Hungary? It is said they go out from their graves at night to suck the blood of the living. But what is most vexing is that these vampires have been the subject of official inquiries by magistrates. These reports are sworn on oath. If vampires exist, what must we think of the rest of history?" Voltaire, ever the skeptic, was mocking the very idea of vampires. Yet the fact that he even acknowledged the hysteria demonstrates how widespread the debate had become. But not everyone was content to let the matter linger in the realm of speculation. As the 18th century wore on, the vampire craze began to meet its greatest opponent, the Age of Reason. In the 1750s, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria took an interest in the vampire hysteria plaguing her lands. Concerned that superstition was undermining public order, she dispatched her personal physician, Gerard van Swieten, to investigate. Van Swieten, a man of science, dismissed the entire phenomenon outright. He argued that vampirism was nothing more than ignorance and fear mixed with the natural processes of decomposition. His report to the Empress was blunt. "There are no vampires, only frightened villagers and corpses behaving as all corpses do." On his recommendation, Maria Theresa issued a decree banning exhumations and vampire executions across the empire. The government took swift action, cracking down on local officials who had allowed these rituals to continue. The panic began to subside. The vampire was not dead, but it had been exorcised from the concerns of rulers and scholars. It had retreated, back into the darkness of folklore. Yet even as the official hysteria died, the legend did not disappear. The vampire had been transformed by the 18th century, not just in fear, but in fascination. It was now something that could be studied, written about, debated. It had entered history, and soon the panic would spread to America. The year is 1892, and in the quiet town of Exeter, Rhode Island, a family is dying. Tuberculosis, consumption as it was known, had long haunted New England. A wasting disease that struck with no warning and lingered for months, even years. It stole weight from the body, left the afflicted pale and gaunt, their ribs showing through thinning skin, their cheeks sunken. They coughed blood into handkerchiefs, their breath coming ragged and shallow. The people of Exeter had seen this before. But for George Brown, it was a horror unfolding within his own home. His wife, Mary Eliza Brown, was the first to succumb. Then his eldest daughter, Mary Olive, wasted away in much the same fashion. Another son died soon after. Now his only remaining son, Edwin, was fading, and the town began to whisper. This was no ordinary illness, they said. Something was feeding. By the late 19th century, tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in the United States, yet it was still poorly understood. It did not spread rapidly like cholera, nor did it strike in obvious outbreaks like smallpox. Instead, it moved slowly, insidiously, consuming one family member after another. To those left behind, it seemed that the dead were preying upon the living. This belief was not new. It had existed in New England for over a century. It came from a time before germ theory, when disease was an enigma and death a creeping shadow. In small towns and farming villages, people sought answers not in science but in folklore. And in their minds, there was only one possible explanation. The dead were refusing to stay buried. They called them vampires, though these creatures were not the aristocratic blood drinkers of European legend. The vampires of New England did not stalk the night in elegant capes or transform into bats. They were family members, recently deceased, lying in their graves, siphoning the life from their own kin. There was only one way to stop them. Desperate to save his only surviving son, George Brown allowed the townspeople to do what had to be done. On March 17, 1892, a small group of men, including the town doctor, gathered in Chestnut Hill Cemetery. They unearthed the bodies of George Brown's wife and daughters. The mother, Mary Eliza, had long since decomposed. So had Mary Olive, the eldest daughter. But when they opened the coffin of Mercy Brown, buried only 2 months before, what they found chilled them to the core. Mercy's body was too well preserved. Her face was unmarked by decay. Her nails and hair seemed to have grown, a common but misunderstood phenomenon caused by the skin receding after death. And when the doctor cut into her chest, they found liquid blood pooled in her heart. To the town, it was all the proof they needed. Mercy Brown was still feeding. The villagers followed the ritual that had been practiced throughout New England. They cut out her heart, burned it to ashes, and mixed the ashes into a tonic. Edwin was given the mixture to drink, a desperate attempt to break the vampire's hold on him. But it did not save him. He died 2 months later. The Mercy Brown case is the most famous, but it was not the first. For nearly 100 years, New England had been gripped by vampire panic. From Maine to Connecticut, families plagued by tuberculosis had turned to the same solution: dig up the dead, find the culprit, destroy the body. Some of these cases left behind chilling evidence. In 1817, in Griswold, Connecticut, a group of children playing in a hillside graveyard accidentally unearthed a skeleton, its bones arranged in a peculiar way. The skull and femurs crossed over the ribcage like a pirate's emblem. When archaeologists later examined the grave, they determined that the body had been exhumed years after burial. Someone had dug it up, broken open the ribs, and reburied it in the shape of a warding sign. This was not a careless grave robbing, it was a vampire ritual. Similar cases were recorded in Exeter, Rhode Island, 1874, when the body of Sarah Tillinghast was dug up and burned. In 1854, in Jewett City, Connecticut, the Ray family suffered multiple deaths from tuberculosis. The town exhumed 2 of the Ray brothers, burned their bodies, and scattered the ashes. In nearly every case, the method was the same. Bodies were dug up and inspected for signs of unnatural preservation. Blood in the heart was the ultimate sign of vampirism. The heart was removed and burned to stop the vampire's influence. In some cases, the entire body was burned, and the ashes were fed to the afflicted as a cure. There is no evidence that these rituals worked. But for the desperate, for those watching their families die one by one, logic did not matter. Only hope. Mercy Brown's exhumation was widely reported, not just in New England, but in newspapers across the country and even in London. One of these clippings found its way into the hands of Bram Stoker. At the time, Stoker was in the final years of writing Dracula, a novel steeped in Eastern European vampire lore. But within his research notes, discovered decades after his death, was a newspaper article describing the Mercy Brown case. Did it shape Dracula? The novel's character Lucy Westenra shares chilling similarities with Mercy, both young women, both dying mysteriously, both found too well preserved after death. And in Dracula, the removal of the heart and the burning of the body are key elements of vampire destruction. It is possible that Stoker, drawing from European and Slavic folklore, found something hauntingly familiar in the Mercy Brown story. He may have realized that the fear of the dead feeding on the living was not just an old-world legend, it was happening in America. The vampire has always lived among its victims. In Europe, it wore the face of a lost loved one, creeping from the grave to feed upon its own kin. In the Caribbean, it moved among the villagers in daylight, only revealing its monstrous hunger after sundown. In China, it hopped stiffly from the coffin, hunting those foolish enough to cross its path. In Africa, it dropped from the treetops, fangs gleaming in the dark. Every culture has its own version of the predator, but certain fears remain universal. The dead should stay buried. Blood is sacred. Life can be stolen. These ideas are not unique to one people or one place. The legends, though shaped by different landscapes and traditions, share something deeper, a connection that transcends borders, passed along trade routes, whispered in the ears of travelers, woven into the beliefs of the next generation. The vampire was never confined to a single story. It spread across continents, taking on new forms, transforming with each encounter. It moved through the minds of merchants, priests, and scholars, carried not in the bloodstream, but in language, in myth, in fear. No myth exists in isolation. For thousands of years, humans have carried their stories with them, passing them from village to village, from one continent to another. Vampires, like all monsters, were shaped not only by local superstition but also by contact with the outside world. In the ancient world, traders moved along the Silk Road from China to Persia, from India to Europe. Ideas traveled with them. The merchants who carried silk and spices also carried stories, tales of Jiangshi in the east, of Vetala in the south, of ghouls in the deserts. These stories blended with local beliefs, mutating, adapting, until they took on new names, new rituals, new horrors. When Arab traders reached West Africa, they brought with them the legend of the Ghoul, a creature that devoured human flesh and drank blood. In turn, the Ashanti spoke of their own night stalkers, the Asanbosam and Obayifo. Did the Ghoul influence African vampire legends, or had the fear already existed, waiting only for a new name? It is impossible to say, but the parallels are undeniable. In the age of exploration, European sailors arrived in the Americas, encountering indigenous myths of blood-drinking spirits and cursed souls. The Aztec Cihuateteo, the Caribbean Soucouyant, and the New England vampires were distant cousins, their stories altered by conquest and time. But the fear remained. Even in the 19th century, as colonial powers expanded into Asia and Africa, European scholars recorded the vampire legends of the people they encountered, reframing them through a Western lens. Sir Richard Burton, in his 1870 translation of Vikram and the Vampire, introduced English audiences to the Hindu Vetala, explicitly calling it a vampire, despite the fact that it was a spirit more than a blood drinker. It was a translation choice, but one that stuck. Even Bram Stoker, while writing Dracula, was influenced by these cross-cultural exchanges. His notes contain references to the Slavic Strigoi, the Icelandic Draugr, and even the Mercy Brown case from New England. Whether intentionally or not, Stoker was gathering pieces from centuries of vampire belief, merging them into something new, something that would outlive its predecessors. If the vampire legend developed independently in different parts of the world, what does that say about us? Why do these creatures appear again and again in so many cultures? Perhaps it is because they speak to something fundamental, an ancient and persistent terror that lingers in the human mind. In nearly every culture, vampires are tied to anxieties about improper burial, restless spirits, and the consequences of disturbing the dead. Whether it is the jiāngshī of China, the Strigoi of Romania, or the Naxera of Germany, there is always the belief that the dead, if not properly laid to rest, will come back. In some cases, this fear led to complex burial rites, stakes driven through corpses, graves lined with salt, heads removed and placed between the legs to prevent the body from walking. Across cultures, blood is sacred. It is the essence of vitality, the thing that separates the living from the dead. It is no coincidence that nearly every vampire figure feeds on blood or life energy. The Aztec Cihuateteo drained the life force from infants. The Vetala of India fed on human spirits. The Soucouyant of the Caribbean stole energy from its victims. Even in folklore, where literal blood drinking is absent, the vampire is always a parasite, feeding off the living in some form. Before germ theory, people sought spiritual reasons for why sickness spread. The European plague vampires and the New England tuberculosis vampires were both born from this same fear. When a family member died of a mysterious illness, it seemed only natural to suspect that they were still feeding on the living. Across cultures, there are patterns in how people defended themselves. Garlic was used in Slavic and Chinese traditions. Stakes were driven through bodies in Europe and India. Salt was a weapon in African, Caribbean, and Asian folklore alike. These protective rituals developed independently, suggesting a shared psychological need to believe that there was a way to stop the thing that comes in the night. This is what makes the vampire unique among monsters. It is not just a single story, but a collection of shared fears adapted to different times, different places. The vampire had traveled far, through time, across continents, through the voices of storytellers and the fears of the superstitious. It had emerged from the deserts of Mesopotamia, clawed through the graveyards of medieval Europe, and whispered through the candlelit rooms of New England's dying. It had taken many forms, shifting from demon to spirit to revenant. And now, it was about to undergo its final transformation. By the 19th century, the vampire was no longer a creature of whispered folklore, nor merely a thing of ritual and fear. It had entered literature, and in doing so, it became something more than a superstition. It became a story. The vampire's first true step into the written word came in 1819, in a tale that would change its nature forever. That year, an English doctor named John Polidori published a short story called The Vampire. It was the first work of fiction to depict the vampire not as a bloated, reanimated peasant, but as something aristocratic, intelligent, and alluring. Its central figure, Lord Ruthven, was a predator unlike those of folklore. He was a nobleman, pale and brooding, possessing an unnatural charm that allowed him to seduce his victims before feeding on them. He did not rise from the grave with dirt beneath his fingernails. He walked among high society, whispering in the ears of the wealthy and powerful. Polidori's story was born from one of the most famous literary gatherings in history, the summer of 1816, when Lord Byron, Mary Shelley, and Percy Bysshe Shelley spent a stormy night at Villa Diodati on Lake Geneva telling ghost stories. Mary Shelley's tale would become Frankenstein. Byron's unfinished fragment, a sketch of a blood-drinking nobleman, was taken up by Polidori, who crafted it into something new. The story was a sensation. For the first time, the vampire had entered English literature, not as a mindless corpse, but as a character. It was no longer just an object of terror, it was an antagonist, a seducer, a figure of dark fascination. Polidori's work set the stage for everything that would follow. By the 1840s, the vampire had become a regular figure in penny dreadfuls, the cheaply printed serials that entertained England's working class. The most famous of these was Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood, published between 1845 and 1847. Sir Francis Varney, the novel's titular vampire, was an evolution of Lord Ruthven, a monstrous but strangely tragic figure. He had sharp fangs, one of the earliest literary descriptions of a vampire's teeth, hypnotic powers, and the ability to revive himself from death. He was also tormented, cursed to his existence, oscillating between predation and regret. Despite its melodrama, Varney the Vampire left its mark. The pale, fanged vampire had now become the standard image, one that would be repeated in future literature and, eventually, film. Then, in 1872, a new kind of vampire emerged, one that could seduce, not just terrify. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla introduced the first major female vampire in fiction, a creature of beauty and danger in equal measure. Unlike Ruthven or Varney, Carmilla did not prey on high society. She preyed on innocent young women, slipping into their lives like a lover, like a shadow. Set in a lonely Austrian castle, Carmilla tells the story of a girl who is slowly drained of life by a mysterious visitor. The predator does not attack outright. She charms. She lingers. She whispers in the dark, draws her victims into an embrace that is part love, part death. Carmilla was daring for its time. The book contained undeniable homoerotic undertones, depicting the vampire not just as a threat to life, but as a corrupting influence, a being who existed outside the boundaries of morality and nature. It was Carmilla that first introduced the idea that a vampire could transform into an animal, taking the form of a cat. It was Carmilla that perfected the slow, creeping dread of a vampire's influence, rather than an outright attack. And it was Carmilla that decades later, Bram Stoker would study as he wrote his own vampire tale. The vampire had evolved. It was no longer just a monster. It was an idea, an infection, something that spread through literature like a disease. And in 1897, it would finally be given its most enduring name. Bram Stoker was not the first to write about vampires. He was not even the first to depict them as elegant, cunning creatures. But he was the first to bring together everything that had come before and mold it into something truly immortal. Dracula was not an accident. It was the result of years of research, of digging through folk tales, historical accounts, and existing literature. Stoker studied the Serbian vampire cases of the 18th century, the Slavic strigoi, the witchcraft trials of Europe, the New England vampire exhumations, and the legends of Vlad the Impaler, blending them into a single character, an embodiment of every fear the vampire had ever represented. Stoker's Dracula was the culmination of centuries of vampire myth. He carried the noble predation of Polidori's Lord Ruthven, stalking his victims with aristocratic ease. He possessed the fangs and hypnotic allure of Varney the vampire, drawing his prey into submission before the final bite. He exuded the corrupting influence of Carmilla, a presence that seeped into the mind as much as the body. He embodied the slow, wasting death of New England's vampire panics, the unseen force that drained families from within. And he was the resurrected corpse of Slavic folklore, a revenant bound to the earth yet desperate to rise. Yet he was also something new. Stoker crafted his vampire with rules. Garlic repelled him, crosses burned him. He could not cross running water. He needed to sleep in the soil of his homeland. These were drawn from various vampire traditions, cementing them into a single codified legend. Dracula was not simply a vampire, he was all vampires. The novel was not an immediate success upon publication, but in time, it became the definitive vampire story. It was the last step in the vampire's journey from folklore to fiction, from grave to immortality. And from there, the vampire would take on a life of its own. The 20th and 21st centuries did not bury the vampire. They resurrected it, reinvented it, made it something new again and again. From Nosferatu to Bela Lugosi's Dracula, from Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire to the Twilight series, the vampire has taken many forms. It has been feared, romanticized, turned into metaphor, reclaimed, reimagined. Even today, echoes of the vampire's past remain. In Romania, some villagers still drive stakes through corpses to prevent them from rising. In rural Africa, modern reports of vampire attacks occasionally surface. In pop culture, the vampire still appears as a symbol of the outsider, of disease, of sexuality, of power and corruption. Yet in each of its forms, the vampire carries traces of what it once was. The ancient demon, the medieval revenant, the whispered fear. One thing is clear: the vampire will never die. It has lived in shadow and fire, in parchment and ink, in fear and fascination. It has survived time itself. And as long as humanity fears the night, fears death, fears something waiting beyond the grave, the vampire will endure. It will always return, watching, waiting, feeding.